Sarah Bennett's weathered hands gripped the reins as 300 cattle thundered behind her along a ledge barely wide enough for 2 horses. One wrong step meant death for them all. Below, her competitors watched in stunned silence as she led the massive herd through Devil's Canyon's most treacherous passage. A route everyone said was impossible. They had no idea how a grieving widow had just outsmarted the most powerful ranchers in Colorado Territory. Sarah Bennett pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of Copper Ridge's general store, watching the crowd gather in the dusty street below. At 34, she had learned to read faces the way her late husband Tom read cattle, and every expression told her the same story. The men adjusting their hats and spitting tobacco juice thought she had lost her mind. The women whispering behind gloved hands believed grief had finally broken her completely. 6 months. That's how long it had been since Tom's body came back draped over his horse, another casualty of Devil's Canyon's hunger for foolish men and good cattle. 6 months of condolences that felt more like accusations, of helpful suggestions that she sell the ranch and disappear back east where widows belonged. 6 months of watching their savings dwindle while the banks circled like vultures over carrion. But today was different. Today, she would give them something real to whisper about. Sarah stepped into the street, her worn boots raising small clouds of dust with each deliberate step. The crowd parted without thinking, the way people always moved aside for someone walking toward either triumph or disaster. She had called this meeting herself, sent word through every ranch hand and store clerk that Sarah Bennett had an announcement to make. Now they waited, hungry for whatever entertainment her desperation might provide. Marcus Holbrook dominated the center of the gathering, his massive frame casting shadows across 3 smaller men. As the territory's cattle king, he owned more land than some eastern states, and possessed the kind of confidence that came from never being wrong about anything that mattered. His pale eyes tracked Sarah's approach with the patience of a predator who knew the prey had nowhere left to run. "Folks," Sarah's voice carried across the street without strain. Ranch life had taught her to make herself heard over wind and cattle and common sense. "I appreciate you all coming out this afternoon," a few men chuckled. Old Pete Morrison nudged his neighbor and whispered something that made them both grin. Sarah had expected this. She had dressed carefully in her best riding clothes, braided her brown hair to keep it from her face, and practiced these words until they felt like stones in her mouth, smooth and heavy and ready to throw. "I'm taking 300 head through Devil's Canyon next week." The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder when the world holds its breath, waiting for the inevitable crash. Then the laughter started, rolling through the crowd like a summer storm. Marcus Holbrook didn't laugh, though. He studied Sarah with the intensity of a man trying to decide whether he was looking at courage or madness. "Sarah, honey," called out Mrs. Henderson from the boardwalk, her voice thick with the kind of pity that burned like acid. "Maybe you should talk to Doc Morrison about something to help you sleep better." More laughter. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her expression steady. She had known this part would be the hardest. Not the canyon, not the cattle, but standing here while people who had eaten at her table treated her like a sideshow attraction. "The canyon route cuts 2 weeks off the drive to Silverton," Sarah continued, as if no one had spoken. "Cattle arrive in better condition, better prices at market." "Better prices don't matter much when you're dead," Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had built an empire by never taking foolish risks. "That canyon has claimed more good men than the Apache Wars." Sarah nodded slowly. Tom always said the same thing. She paused, letting them remember her husband, letting them think about his broken body and failed dreams. But Tom was wrong about a lot of things. The crowd stirred restlessly. This wasn't going the way anyone expected. The banker's face turned the color of old leather when Sarah walked into First National the next morning. Henry Whitmore had been avoiding her for weeks, sending his clerk with excuses about meetings and important correspondence. But Sarah had learned patience from watching cattle. Sometimes you had to wait for the right moment to move. "Mrs. Bennett," Whitmore's voice cracked slightly as he gestured toward the chair across from his polished desk. "I heard about your announcement yesterday." Sarah settled into the chair without removing her hat. Ladies were supposed to remove their hats indoors, but ladies weren't supposed to do a lot of things she planned to accomplish. "I need to discuss my loan extension." About that, Whitmore shuffled through papers with hands that trembled just enough to rattle the documents. The bank has concerns about your current state of mind. The words hung between them like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Sarah had expected this conversation, had prepared for it the same way she prepared for everything now, by thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone who underestimated her. My state of mind is focused on paying what I owe, she said quietly. The canyon route will get my cattle to market first. Prime prices, full payment by month's end. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, studying her with the expression of a man trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Sarah, that canyon killed your husband? It's killed more men than I can count. The bank cannot extend credit based on a suicide mission. She had known he would say exactly those words. Men like Whitmore lived by patterns, followed rules, made safe bets. They saw the world in columns of numbers that always had to balance perfectly. What they couldn't see was the knowledge burning in her chest like a banked coal, waiting for the right wind to fan it into flame. Give me 2 weeks, Sarah said, standing to leave. If I'm not back by then, you can have the ranch. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet bank. Outside, the morning sun painted the dusty street in shades of gold and amber, but Sarah's mind was already in the canyon, tracing paths that existed only in her memory, and the whispered words of people most folks in Copper Ridge would rather forget. 3 years ago, when Apache raiders had limped onto her land with bullet wounds and fever, Sarah had made a choice that scandalized the territory. While other ranchers shot first and buried the bodies later, she had dragged the wounded men into her barn and spent 2 weeks nursing them back to health. Tom had raged, threatened, pleaded with her to see reason. The neighbors had whispered about Indian lovers and traitorous women who betrayed their own kind. But Sarah had seen something different in those dark eyes. Not the savage hatred everyone expected, but the same desperate love of family that drove her own choices. One of the men, an elder named Grey Wolf, had spoken English learned from missionary schools. As his strength returned, he had watched Sarah work with the quiet intensity of someone weighing a debt that couldn't be measured in gold or cattle. On the night before they left, Grey Wolf had drawn maps in the dirt floor of the barn, not the obvious trails that white men followed, but the ancient paths his people had used for generations, routes that worked with the canyon's natural flow instead of fighting against it. He had shown her how to read the landscape's subtle language, how water carved hidden ledges, where seemingly impossible passages offered safe harbor for those who understood their secrets. The stone remembers, he had whispered in the flickering lamplight. Learn to listen, and it will show you the way. Now riding toward Devil's Canyon in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah finally understood what he meant. The landscape spoke in whispers that most people never bothered to hear. Wind patterns that indicated stable ledges, rock formations that provided shelter from sudden storms, water sources hidden from obvious view but clear to anyone who knew how to look. She had spent weeks making these secret journeys, memorizing every twist and turn of the Apache routes. Each trip revealed new details: a narrow passage behind a waterfall, a ledge that curved around a seemingly impassable cliff face, shortcuts that could save hours or even days of travel time. The canyon walls rose around her now like the ribs of some massive beast, painted in shades of red and orange that seemed to glow with inner fire. Sarah's horse, a sure-footed mare named Belle, picked her way along paths that would have terrified most riders. But Sarah felt no fear, only the growing certainty that she had found something precious beyond measure. Behind her, hidden in the pre-dawn shadows, Carlos and Miguel followed on their own horses. She had hired the Mexican vaqueros, despite whispered warnings about their kind, partly because their skills with cattle were unmatched, but mostly because they understood what it meant to be underestimated by people who should know better. "Señora," Carlos had said when she first approached them about the job, "the other ranchers, they think we know nothing because we speak with accent. But we know cattle, we know mountains, and we know when a person has fire in their heart that will not be put out." The 3 of them made an unlikely crew: a widowed woman, 2 immigrant cowboys, and a secret that could change everything. But as they explored the ancient pathways, Sarah began to see the shape of something larger than simple survival. She was mapping a future that no one else could imagine, building an advantage that would last long after the current crisis passed. By the time they emerged from the canyon each morning, Sarah's clothes were dusty and her hands scratched from scrambling over rocks. But her mind was clear with purpose. She would buy cattle from desperate sellers, choosing hardy animals over pretty ones. She would plan every detail with the precision of a military campaign. And when the time came, she would lead her herd through passages that existed beyond the edge of everyone's expectations. The sun was fully up when Sarah finally turned Belle toward home, but her thoughts remained in the canyon's hidden depths. Tomorrow she would begin gathering her herd. Next week she would attempt something that would either save her ranch or destroy her completely. Either way, she would do it on terms that no one else understood, using knowledge that existed in the spaces between what people thought they knew and what was actually possible. The canyon had taught her its secrets, and soon the whole territory would discover what a grieving widow could accomplish. When she stopped listening to other people's limitations and started trusting the whispers of ancient stone, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she guided her horse along the narrow ledge, 300 cattle following in a line that stretched back into the canyon's shadowy depths. This was the moment she had prepared for through countless sleepless nights and secret dawn rides. Behind her, Carlos and Miguel rode with the quiet intensity of men who understood that one mistake would send them all tumbling into the rocky abyss below. The morning air carried sounds that would have terrified most drovers: the scrape of hooves against stone, the nervous lowing of cattle navigating passages barely wide enough for their bodies, the whisper of wind through crevices that seemed to mock human ambition. But Sarah heard something different in these sounds. She heard the rhythm of ancient knowledge, the steady beat of a plan that was working exactly as Grey Wolf had promised it would. Her competitors had no idea she was already halfway through Devil's Canyon, while they were just beginning their safe northern route. Marcus Holbrook and his fellow ranchers had delayed their departure by 3 days, so confident in her failure that they saw no need to hurry. They expected to hear news of her death before their own herds even left the valley. Instead, Sarah was about to prove that the most dangerous thing in the territory wasn't the canyon itself, but the assumptions people made about what was possible. The ledge ahead narrowed to a point where it seemed impossible for cattle to pass, but Sarah knew better. Grey Wolf had shown her how the Apache moved entire hunting parties through this exact passage, understanding that what looked like a dead end was actually an optical illusion created by the angle of the rock face. 20 feet beyond the apparent cliff, the path opened into a sheltered valley with grass and water, a secret oasis that white settlers had never discovered because they never looked past the obvious dangers. Belle stepped confidently along the rocky shelf, trusting Sarah's guidance the way the cattle trusted Belle's example. This was how the ancient routes worked, Sarah realized, not through force or fighting against the landscape's natural flow, but through understanding the subtle connections that held everything together. Fear made animals panic and people stupid, but confidence created a chain of trust that could accomplish impossible things. The first group of cattle rounded the narrow passage without incident, their hooves finding purchase on stone, worn smooth by centuries of wind and weather. Sarah felt a surge of vindication that warmed her more than the morning sun. Every person who had laughed at her announcement, every banker who had questioned her sanity, every well-meaning friend who had urged her to give up, they were all wrong about what a determined woman could accomplish with the right knowledge. Miles behind her, Holbrook's crew was discovering that their safe route carried dangers of its own. Unseasonable storms had turned familiar trails into muddy disasters, and competing herds from other ranches had eaten the grazing down to stubble. What should have been a routine drive was becoming a costly nightmare of delays and lost cattle. By the time they reached Silverton, Sarah would already have her herd sold and her profits counted. The irony wasn't lost on her. While men who prided themselves on practical thinking struggled with problems they should have anticipated, a grieving widow was succeeding through knowledge they had dismissed as worthless. The Apache paths weren't just faster and safer, they were hidden in plain sight, invisible to anyone who refused to see beyond their own assumptions about how things should work. Sarah emerged from Devil's Canyon 2 days later with every single head of cattle accounted for and in excellent condition. The railroad depot at Silverton buzzed with activity as buyers competed for her premium stock, driving prices higher than anyone had seen all season. Standing in the dusty stockyard with a bank draft that would save her ranch and establish her reputation, Sarah finally understood that she hadn't just survived her husband's death. She had discovered something entirely new. News traveled fast in Colorado Territory, especially news that made powerful men look foolish. By the time Sarah's train pulled into Copper Ridge 3 days later, half the town had gathered at the depot to witness her return. The same faces that had laughed at her canyon announcement now wore expressions of stunned disbelief mixed with grudging respect. Sarah stepped onto the platform carrying herself differently than when she'd left. The bank draft in her coat pocket represented more than money. It was proof that a woman's determination could reshape an entire industry. Her cattle had sold for premium prices, while her competitors were still struggling through muddy northern trails, their safe route proving far more dangerous than anyone anticipated. Marcus Holbrook waited near the station house, his massive frame somehow diminished by circumstances beyond his control. Sarah had heard through railroad gossip that his herd was stuck in a valley 40 miles north, trapped by unseasonable flooding that had turned familiar crossings into impassable torrents. The cattle king who had mocked her suicide mission was now facing his own disaster. Mrs. Bennett, he approached, with the careful respect men reserve for those who had proven them spectacularly wrong. I believe I owe you an apology. Sarah nodded, but didn't smile. Victory felt different than she had expected, quieter, more complete. You owe me a prize bull, actually, according to the wager you made in front of half the territory. Holbrook's face flushed red above his collar, but he couldn't argue with facts witnessed by dozens of people. The bet had seemed so safe, so obvious. No woman could succeed where countless men had failed. Now his certainty looked like expensive arrogance. Within a week, other ranchers began approaching Sarah with offers to guide their herds through Devil's Canyon. They waved thick envelopes of cash and spoke in respectful tones about partnerships and exclusive arrangements. Sarah listened politely to each proposal, then declined with the same quiet confidence she had carried into the canyon. The Apache routes would remain her secret, protected knowledge that gave her an advantage no amount of money could buy. She had learned something valuable in those hidden passages, that the most powerful weapon wasn't strength or numbers, but understanding things others couldn't see. Standing at Tom's grave on a quiet Sunday morning, Sarah placed fresh wildflowers beside his headstone and spoke words meant only for him. She had kept her promise, succeeded where he had failed, and built something lasting from the ashes of their shared dreams. The ranch was safe, her reputation established, her future secure. But more importantly, she had discovered that grief could transform into something unexpected. Not just survival, but triumph beyond anything she had dared imagine.